I'm delighted to welcome you all to this National Pathways event. For those that don't know me, I'm Sarah Buckley, the CEO of the Truella Foundation and the National Co-Convener of Pathways to Politics. So I'm delighted today to be in conversation with the Honourable Gabrielle Upton MP. Gabrielle has had a varied and fascinating career path with 30 years combined experience as a lawyer, banker, government minister and deputy chancellor. And let me just share a few highlights with you. Gabrielle is currently an advisory board member of the new ARC Centre of Excellence in Quantum Biotechnology at the University of Queensland and a member of the New South Wales Pathways Advisory Committee, for which we're very grateful. Gabrielle has Bachelors of Arts and Law from the University of New South Wales, an MBA from NYU's Leonard Stern School of Business, and graduated from Harvard Business School's Advanced Management Program. She's a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and of the Royal Society of New South Wales. Gabrielle's career began as a corporate lawyer with legal firms Herbert Smith Freehills and DLA Piper, and as a banker with Deutsche Bank and Toronto Dominion Bank in New York, financing the energy sector. She then served as a member of the Corporate Markets and Advisory Committee to the federal government and as legal counsel at the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Gabrielle was Deputy Chancellor of the University of New South Wales from 2006 until 2009 and a board member of Neuroscience Research Australia, NEURA, one of Australia's largest research centres on the brain and nervous system. And after all of that extraordinary career, she then moved into office and she was elected in 2011 and was there until earlier this year. And that included as the first female New South Wales Attorney General, Minister for the Environment, Local Government and Heritage, Minister for Family and Community Services, and I understand the first female Liberal Minister for Sport and Recreation. So just prior to retiring from politics, Gabrielle seized the opportunity to undertake a Commonwealth Parliamentary Association study tour of the USA, Canada and UK to understand the possible models for a practical induction program and other initiatives to equip new women MPs in the New South Wales Parliament and hopefully for other parliaments to adopt too. Gabrielle has subsequently provided recommendations and a report to the New South Wales Parliament called On the Record, Building Know-How for New Women MPs. And Ariel is going to pop that in the chat so you can have a look at the full report and we'll talk about this shortly. So Gabrielle and I are going to talk for about half an hour and then we would love to open it up for questions. So please start thinking about that and we'll use the raise hand function when we get to that part of the discussion. But Gabrielle, let's start by exploring your journey. As I just outlined, you've had such a varied and successful career prior to becoming a politician. So what then drew you into politics? Oh, and mute, unfortunately.
Unmute. There you go. It's a trick you think I would have learned by now. So hello to everybody. I'm just so pleased to be in your company. I want to thank Sarah and the Truella Foundation and to founder Carol Schwartz, who really was the inspiration for this training program for women to feel more confident about running for public office or to support the political system. I have been on the Advisory Council at UNSW in New South Wales, which is the way that the program is rolled out in New South Wales. And I thought it was even more important to remain involved after I left politics. I've left that profession very gratefully. I had a wonderful time, the best and worst, I think, at times, but I'm really grateful for that experience and the honour of serving my local community in the state as a minister. I also wanted to thank Sarah for her good help when I went on my study tour. She was so helpful in opening up a number of doors to speak with people about my report that we'll address a little bit longer. So thank you for doing the program. Some of you will want to run for office, others may not, but I only wish a program like this was available when I was thinking of going to politics, which is about 20 years ago. So it's quite a long time ago. And then it took me about 10 years to the point where I was in a pre-selection, which I won. And we'll talk about that experience. But to address your question, Sarah, my call into politics was quite a late one. I was always very community involved. I was the student president of the law school at UNSW. That wasn't a political role, but it was a community leadership role. I found I was always wanting to be in touch with community wherever I lived, but I think it really crystallised for me after a time I spent living in New York City. I went there with my husband. I studied and then worked, and it's such a dynamic place, the US, for politics. Love it or loathe it. It has some of the best and worst of politics, and I couldn't vote. We lived there for 6 years. It was a sizable time. And I think that really made me understand the importance of being active in a political system, being able to participate in it. So my real interest crystallised to action when I came back from the US. But I think I'd been heading that direction for a while. So I suppose what I would say is, for those of you out there that are coming to this a little bit late, like I did, there is always a time. It's actually having that kind of clear desire to do this with almost the exclusion of other things that I think can kind of throw yourself and give you the best opportunity to serve in a political role.
I was interested, I read a quote, I think they were asking about, moving into politics and sort of a framing around your experience in the business sector and, understanding that markets don't necessarily do everything right, and that you felt there was sort of a need for care and compassion along perhaps that sector. And I'm just curious if some of that was the driver towards seeing a role for you in politics to apply that.
That's right. When I came back from the US, I knew I wanted to have a role in building a better community, which sounds very lofty, but it really, with my skill set as a lawyer and then in banking, I wanted to take those skills and I wanted to use them to have a better opportunity of influencing policy and laws. And in the roles that I took, and you mentioned some of them after I came back, I really couldn't get stuff done. I was able to influence and to make representations, but I couldn't actually change the laws or change the policy of the day. And I found that quite frustrating, because I had some ideas around creating jobs, creating a better community, growing the economy. They were things that were very attractive to me. And yet, of course, as a minister, I did have experiences in social portfolios, which was a great learning experience for me, and probably the experience I most value out of the ministries that had a social policy focus.
And do you remember that moment that you decided to go for it and go for pre-selection? Because I think there was a bit of a gap. There was almost 10 years of you joining the party and then running. So what was that sort of trigger, or were you approached? What was the story behind you going for pre-selection?
Well, for those who are on the webinar, I literally turned up and I called the Liberal Party headquarters in New South Wales and I said, how do I get involved? I mean, I was literally that naive about it all. And they said, well, first thing you do is you join a local branch. And so I was put in touch with somebody who was the secretary of that branch. The moment crystallised for me, I think, at the point where I'd had enough encouragement, as it turned out, from another very senior woman in the party who serendipitously I became encouraged by. And her approach, and I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, was pretty much, just give it a go, see how it feels, nothing lost, nothing if you don't venture. So mine, you mentioned the 10-year period. It's interesting in that my experience of politics is, if you do want to be involved, which was my kind of desire, I didn't really know whether that meant in a public official role or whether that meant in just an organisational role or being a policy advisor to a minister. I really hadn't really identified where I wanted to make my contribution. So I tried some of those roles on as I went. I did run for pre-selection for the Senate, and I think it was at that point, that wasn't I want to run again and be in Parliament, but I did know that that was something I could do, would do, and I failed miserably in that contest for the Senate. And I came second to last, I think, in the competition. I kind of went, what's going on here? I think I have something to contribute. It was that made me clearer about the fact that it was a complex, sophisticated organisation where I actually had to understand how it worked better to be successful in it. And so I'd say that moment of, pragmatism meets desire was really the point, and that would have been in 2005. And then I think serendipity and luck plays a little bit in life. I happen to be well-positioned organisationally and senior enough to be one of the front runners for a safe seat in New South Wales called the Seat of Vaucluse. And so that was in 2010 when I ran for that, knowing that, I'd either win or not, but I had a very good prospect of winning that. And if I didn't, I would have tried my best.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think, it's so important sharing those stories that it often takes multiple times. I think that's really, that sense of you've got to put yourself out there, and it can be challenging, but you pick yourself up, you learn from it, and then you see where you can take it from there and look at the career that you then built in politics. So, you obviously have worked in a lot of male-dominated environments, whether that's the legal profession or banking, but what was it like once you entered politics in 2011? Were there aspects that you found particularly challenging? How did you navigate all of that?
Look, I did find it challenging because, remember from what I've said, I worked in professional environments. I worked in a large law firm. I worked in an international bank. I had roles, as you mentioned, in a university, a senior role. People were quite respectful, I suppose, and they were professional environments. That doesn't mean there isn't small p politics in any of those organisations, but I had to learn another way of communicating. I had to learn, my language had to change slightly, particularly when I became a minister, and we might talk about that, to be able to everybody is a stakeholder when you're a politician. Everybody. There's no person that you turn away. And so you have to be able to communicate in ways that people, it will sit well with them. And some of the language that I would use in professional environments just wasn't going to fly in a political environment. So that was, I wouldn't say, an insurmountable challenge. I think, in fact, that's been such an amazing experience for me. That's a skill that I've developed and honed through the experience of politics. I hadn't done a lot of media, and if I had done media before that, it was always within the kind of environments I've explained, where people are pretty respectful. They're interested in the ideas, but there is an element of politics which is about theatre, and sometimes it's performance over substance. And so that I really had to change my orientation at times. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I had to kind of let that go a bit, which was a bit challenging for me, because if you worked as a lawyer where the detail matters and every word has a particular impact, I had to kind of stand back from that and say, well, I have to let go of some of that. And sometimes, because there's so much going on, near enough is good enough. And I think the final thing I'd say that I found quite challenging, and I've noticed since I've stepped out of politics now and retired 5 months ago, is there's an intense interest in you as a person and your family. People really want to know the you. It was so different from the other roles I'd had, where you'd say, I work for, fill in brand name, Coca-Cola or IBM, whatever you want to say, and people kind of judge you or whatever, but they don't really want to know what's inside you, what drives you. Politics is like that. People really want to know what you think about things. And I learned the best way to do that was I really had to search and examine and understand myself better. And I benefited from that experience, because I learned, and it was difficult at times, that I needed to be honest and authentic about what my views were about things. It was a point of strength to speak from, to advocate from, and it worked well even in contentious environments. If people really understood why you were of an opposing view to them, they would at least give you that respect. And so that personalisation of everything you do in politics was something I also had to grapple with.
That's great. I think there are many common themes there that are explored throughout the Pathways program. I'm curious though, I'm sure all of those are challenges that new politicians come up against, but what about the gendered aspects of that? You mentioned that getting that experience in the media, or finding that sort of authentic voice. Any sort of reflections as you came into Parliament in those early days? What were some of those experiences?
So I learned pretty quickly, but it became more important as I became a minister, that I needed to up the energy levels, needed to be more assertive. And in some forums and important decision-making capacities, it wasn't necessarily what I said, it was more how I said it. So, you know, this is a in my experience of life is a common feature of other environments in which women are a minority. It's almost like you have to earn your place. You don't, and in my case, necessarily have the physical presence to create an authority. In politics, your title does not give you authority. You earn authority, and that is speaking with a great deal more assurance, because sometimes the vibe matters more than what it is that you're saying. So, you know, there were, to give you an example, there were important meetings I would go into or in a parliamentary setting where we'd practice, and I'd have to practice kind of, as I say, being a larger version of myself in the way I stood, the way I projected myself, the way I spoke. And this goes to the heart of the work that I did and the recommendations in my study tour, that I really do believe that when women come into Parliament, there is that assistance that could be given to train them up, to give them an opportunity to understand what that might mean when you're speaking in Parliament, and to do that where there are no risks or very few risks other than a good laugh from some of your colleagues who have been supportive of you. Because the way I had to learn was, when I was a minister, for example, not acquitting that expectation of theatre or of assuredness that really that forum required of you. And the reason why that matters is because it's when you grow that respect in the ways that I've said are important in a parliamentary environment, that's when people will deal with you as an equal, listen to what you have to say. Vulnerability is a weakness in politics, in those kind of very theatrical settings. And again, I'm particularly talking about where there are high stakes negotiations, or where it is in Parliament where, you know, question time is a performance in theatre.
That's what I was thinking as you were saying that. It's almost the performative, becoming more comfortable with those performative elements. I'm interested, did you over time gain comfort in that ability almost to amplify yourself and that sense of holding your ground and still feel authentic in the way you did it? Or did it always feel performative?
I grew more comfortable with it. It's not my natural style. And that's not the case for every woman. You may be trained or be in a line of career where that's something that you developed. If you had a career in media, for example, coming to politics, I think you'd find that performance aspect of it a little bit more comfortable. But it's something I'd have to think about, you know, and look, I'm not alone, because, you know, I think there is a gendered aspect to this. There's no question. But my colleagues, my male colleagues would have a similar, if you will. And again, I'm focusing on the performance part of question time, which is what a lot of people measure parliamentary performance, and definitely your colleagues measure your standing in how you survive in that very combative environment, as is the New South Wales Parliament, called the bear pit. It is something that you practice, and most ministers, before they go to question time, will do that kind of, it's almost like a, you know, being an opera singer. You kind of do your breathing exercises, find your voice, become, as I said, a bigger version of yourself.
That's so interesting. And look, clearly you were able to kind of adapt and contribute and have impact. I mean, you very quickly started taking on ministerial roles and obviously became the first woman to become the New South Wales Attorney General, which is a huge achievement. I mean, what were some of the things you touched on a little bit before? Perhaps it was some of the more social services focused portfolios, but what were you most proud of achieving during those years?
I was a Family Community Services Minister. I think that was a great introduction to becoming an Attorney General. You know, I would have thought, and an Attorney General has two roles. So you are the first law officer of the land, so you have kind of a constitutional role, and you are a politician. So you're like pretty much no other minister of the Crown, and that has its own challenges, but I won't kind of focus on those today. But that kind of social aspect of being Attorney General, a lot of what you do in the state as Attorney General is oversight the criminal justice system. And my understanding of social policy, of vulnerability, really helped me understand what were some of the reasons that were leading to some of the issues we had in the criminal justice system, if I can kind of abbreviate it by calling it that. And I was really pleased. This is in 2016 or so, 2017. The focus on domestic and family violence was not nearly as big a topic and place of action for governments and social services. And so we did some work during that time, very early days, where we passed a reform in Parliament where women could be in the court or in the criminal justice system where they were victims, but they didn't have to go to the court. They could give their evidence separately in another room, so they wouldn't have to confront the perpetrator in the court, which of course would be a very terrifying thing to do. We did a similar reform, and I say we because this is, as any minister in government knows, it is a combination of your fantastic public servants, it's your cabinet colleagues who support these reforms, and ultimately it's your cohort of MPs in Parliament that allow these to become laws. This is not something you can do without bringing over those other people to support such a reform. But we also did a reform in the area of child sexual abuse. So these are difficult issues, but my concern was that, if it was difficult for women who are victims of domestic violence to go to the court, what must it be like for a child where an adult had been the perpetrator? So we came up with a reform where we allowed someone who was something like a social worker or a psychologist who was not associated with the court in any way to be what we call a children's champion, to help them through the proceedings of court, so that they would find that as best an experience as you could. I mean, even I wouldn't be looking forward to my day in court if I was somebody that was a victim of those horrible crimes, but this was a way of making that experience less traumatic.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing. I was interested, all politicians inevitably have political barbs thrown at them through the media, but I did come across one quote that stood out, and it was from a senior unnamed source, as these sorts of ones do tend to be, and I'll just read it out. "I hate even saying this, but she's only on the front bench because she is a woman." So, how did you react to those sorts of outrageous statements? What did you find was the best way to deal with that kind of very ridiculously gendered criticism?
Well, it's funny. I'm laughing. It wasn't very funny at the time, as you can imagine. My approach was to just kind of ignore it and get on with it. And when you are in these roles of authority in government, you're going to get these barbs. And I suppose this goes back to another point I'd make, that I had to grow tough pretty quickly. That doesn't mean you desensitise yourself, or when there's not something really profoundly bad, you don't call it out. But these are the barbs that are traded in politics, and it is always an unnamed source. So I suppose I'd observed enough of politics at that point to know this is probably going to happen. And because I was a senior minister at that point, that, you wouldn't even know where that came from. It might have been your colleagues sitting behind you who'd like your job. It might have been the opposition. It might have been somebody else. You've always got the background chatter that's negative, and part of the job is to hear it and then move beyond it. So my view was not to buy into it. It was, then I'd get distracted, upset, whatever. Another person may have a different view and might want to take it front on. But I just thought, no, I'm going to kind of switch and bait and go this way. And my vindication of that, or my hope of that, was that by doing the job well, you'd prove that that wasn't the case. And, I think that is, Sarah, coming back to some of the questions you've asked me, there almost is a kind of an expectation that I'd fail at the job because I was the first woman to do the job. So you do come up a little bit against that. And I kind of expected that would be the sentiment in some places in politics. So, yeah, you've heard my approach.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. And obviously, you were there for a significant period of time. You would have seen several new cohorts of female MPs come through right across the political spectrum. And I was just really interested for you to share some of those key challenges you witnessed other women confronting, and was there commonality? Were you starting to see some themes come through in terms of their experience as they stepped into Parliament?
Well, one of the really good things was I went back with a couple of my colleagues to speak to the new cohort out of the New South Wales 2023 election. And that cohort, there are 26 new MPs. So it gives you an idea. We have fixed terms here in the New South Wales Parliament every 4 years. And every 4 years is about a third of the Legislative Assembly, which is the lower house that turns over in terms of membership, which is healthy, I think. So half of that cohort were women, which was a first ever in the New South Wales Parliament. And I do think it goes to an assumption I have, which I still hold to after that experience, that having a critical mass of women as MPs in the Parliament, it does change the vibe, the setting. It does make a difference. There can be cultural shifts when you've got, that group of women in the Parliament, and they're different ages too. That enables you probably to speak up and call out behaviours that might not sit well with what you think is right in an environment such as is politics and Parliament. I think there's a lot of, it might sound trivial, but I come back to the point that in politics, people want to know the real you. They also take a lot of interest in what you wear, what you say, how groomed you are or not groomed. And that is a higher level, a higher bar, I think, that women are held to still around that. And so, it was interesting in that, one of the, women would say, well, not many women in Parliament wear, kind of suits with pants. What's going on here? Because that's quite common in the environment outside Parliament. But, there isn't, and men still wear ties in Parliament. I mean, it is a traditionally dressed environment. And so they'd often kind of say, I don't believe it, really, you have to wear a skirt here. And of course, that's not a rule, but the kind of
norms,
the convention, the norms, to your point, So just, that might sound quite strange to people who work in much more modern work environments, but it's a traditional work environment when you go to Parliament.
And so I guess let's get into sort of the study tour and the report itself. I mean, I was really interested, you sort of opened the report saying Australian parliaments have traditionally been male-dominated institutions which have led to a masculine culture being reflected in parliament's practices and conventions. And this legacy makes parliaments challenging environments for women MPs to work in and succeed. So I know you really hoped you were going to find some examples of how this has been positively tackled in other parts of the world. So let's hear a bit about the study tour. What did you find as you went through the US and Canada and UK?
So let me come to the recommendations I made and address the first one. It was to say that, so I was testing a hypothesis when I went overseas. After spending 12 years in that role and coming out the other side, I really believed that there was a place for a short, very practical program of induction for women of all parties. And my belief was that that would create a collegiality. They are still in a large minority of most parliaments in Australia, and that there would be a fellowship, friendships across the, as we call, across the desk with other members of other parties, which I think is really important. So the recommendation read that, and I did not find a comparable program in.
I was really astounded by that we really don't seem to have anyone tackling this directly in terms of support in those first few months when they're in office.
Yeah, there were examples, Sarah, of parties themselves providing this induction. There was not one in the party of which I was a member of. And so there's that, but mine was a little bit more fundamentally as we need to create a fellowship amongst the women in Parliament. They will draw strength from that. They'll be able to, share anecdotes and more practically get stuff done, really, because when you're a minister, you don't get 100% of what you want. You do need to negotiate with other people in Parliament, so it would have that benefit, and that these women could have that fellowship continue over the 4 years of their serving in Parliament. So it was as much for a social benefit and community as much as for what could be a very practical, bespoke program. And no, I did not find one that was bipartisan, which was my recommendation.
Yeah, and I think of the foundations of Pathways, that is exactly what we're trying to create, is that completely non-partisan sense of, and not just a network of support, but deep friendship and guidance. And, you know, I think that's alive and well here, and hopefully will flow into our parliaments. But I take your point. I think there is an opportunity to really actively curate that and build that ethos and thinking right from the start of as these cohorts come through. Yeah. And tell us a little bit about what you imagine might be covered off beyond the social aspects. I know you had some thoughts on actual practical skills training and support for them as well.
So I should just back up and say this study tour involved going and meeting with wonderful groups of people who work in this area of women in politics. So there was the Harvard Kennedy School, and I sat with a group of, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Carol, with women who are at Harvard and are enrolled in a comparator program to the Pathways program, which is called From Harvard Square to the Oval Office, and talk to them about my experience. So those are women like yourselves here who would like to be involved in politics. I went to Canada and visited the National Parliament. I went to Boston's state parliament or legislature, which had other things that they did, but not in the realm of this practical induction. I went to the UK and met with Julia Gillard and Theresa May, peers in the House of Lords, the Scottish National Party woman who's in Parliament there. So there was a diversity. And then I continued some of that research when I was back here, talking to people that were involved, women who were former politicians across the whole spectrum as well. So it wasn't everybody that I spoke to put it that way, but I did understand there was no such program. So some of the practical things, however, were around social media. And so there has been academic work in the UK that points out that women in politics are more likely to be harassed on social media and in other forum than men are. And that's not something I think, as I understand, there's a lot of academic writing on here. So I think a component of that would be, you know, when you become a politician in Parliament, you are probably going to be greeted by a lot of reaction to social media you post, and it would be some offensive and kind of defensive tactics and strategies around that. First, you're preparing women for the fact that that will probably happen, and you just don't go, well, why is that happening? You know, the Twitter sphere or X or whatever it is that you need to be a part of, because you need to communicate your messages as an environment where the anonymity allows for a lot of bad behaviours. So I think it would be that. I think it would be the thing that I identified before. How do you speak in Parliament? Where do you stand? How do you make the space that you need to sound authoritative? What manner of voice do you need to use? So it might be just tips of the trade. I mean, this is what might sound a trivial example, but something that almost brought me unstuck as a minister. And this would happen as an MP as well. I had to do a media conference, and I happened to be in a place that was very windy. I had hair about the length that I have now, and it was a great distraction for me and also great fun for media to see me trying to do a press conference where my hair was blowing all around the place. So, you know, I share that with as many women who are in politics as I can, because it's just a matter of being prepared. You know, keep your hair tie close. Think about where you might do this media conference. If you've got great people advising you, they'll probably say, let's not do it in an area where you're going to be attacked by the wind. But you do have to think about those things. And, you know, men don't, frankly. So they're the kind of practical things that I think are a gender lens that you would bring to the role that would benefit women coming after me.
Fantastic. Let's talk briefly about the second recommendation, because I think this is, you know, it's almost sort of the evolution of those early experiences of building fellowships. So can you talk us through this concept of an all-party women's committee, which is a little bit different to a caucus? So maybe you can sort of talk about, as you learned about the different models and what you felt would work particularly well.
So I saw examples of this in both in the UK and Canada. Most parliaments will have what they call standing committees of parliament, and they are bipartisan. They might have more government members of the day because the policy agenda of those committees, I suppose, is something the government likes to have more of an influence over. And that's just also the sheer weight of numbers. The government's going to have more people in Parliament as MPs than an opposition or crossbenchers, as we call them, those people who belong to the minority parties. But it was a standing committee, I think we need in New South Wales, where women's issues, broad women's issues, it's not just issues for women in politics, but any issue that might be of concern to women. It could be a social issue, it could be a professional issue, it could be an economic issue. We need a parliament of the committee that's set up and as a standing committee because in the UK they have one in Canada. The one in Canada I sat in on the proceedings, and I thought it was a very good device in that the chair of this committee was, yes, a woman, and they did have a man on this committee. There's a role for somebody to sit on it in that with that gender. But the person that chaired the committee was a woman from the opposition. And I thought that was a really great way to create more collegiality and a constructive environment in which to work. So even though the woman that chaired this committee was not of the government, of the National Parliament of Canada, there were members of the Liberal Party, as it's called there, which is the party of Justin Trudeau, who sat on this. And I think that, again, kind of creates some very solid foundations for it, that it's not just about a committee that's going to be dominated by the politics of the day. It's about much more important issues. So hence my recommendation that we need a standing committee in the way that we have them around economic development. I think there's one on children and young people. It was insightful to me to realise that we didn't have one that would focus on these issues.
Fantastic. Great. And just one last question, and then I'd love to open it up for everyone to start asking some questions to Gabrielle as well. But so what's going to be required for the New South Wales Parliament to adopt these two recommendations? You've put the report forward. What's next?
So we had an election in March. I've let a little bit of dust settle. As new governments come, there's a lot of settling with their structures and their focus and whatever. So the task at hand is I have support from the clerk of the New South Wales Parliament, who is not a political person, but the person that guides the Parliament and has a role in the overall running and management of the organisation at the Parliament. I will be speaking to the Minister for Women and the Opposition Minister for Women. I think it's also an issue that would be important to have the leadership of the Premier and the opposition leader as well, because again, I come back to the point that this is about creating the best environment and the best possible platform for success and equipping women in the Parliament, who gratefully are many more in their number than they were when I was there. But it's still critical to acknowledge that the culture of the New South Wales Parliament, and I suspect other parliaments in Australia, indeed the National Parliament, don't change as quickly as you might expect, and that we need to be helping women who are, as we all know, more than 50% of the population now, to succeed in that environment as much as we might in a corporate or public sector environment. Sarah, what you were saying about the number of women who have been through the program and have been elected. So I'm seeing here, electoral successes can be claimed from the Pathway to Politics program you run, and that there are many more women, I think over 100, you were telling me, who've run for pre-selection or for office. So I'm very optimistic. I mean, this is a really important area, and I would argue, maybe others would disagree, a critical important part of contribution that women need to make is into the Parliament, and the critical massive numbers we see over a very short period of time, as I've just demonstrated, makes me really hopeful for the impact that women can bring into the Parliament.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for sharing all the wealth of your knowledge and experience. And, I really hope that these recommendations are seriously considered and adopted by the New South Wales Parliament, and that they become a catalyst for parliaments at all levels to really think about how they're better supporting female politicians to thrive. So Thank you all for joining us and being part of this conversation. And until next time, take care, goodbye, and see you soon.